Hello students, my name is Dr. Ashutosh and in today's lecture we are going to see the osteology of elbow joint. Till now in our biomechanics series we have studied the biomechanics of the shoulder joint, in which we studied the osteology of the shoulder joint. Also we saw the general features of the sternoclavicular joint, acromioclavicular joint and also the glenohumeral joint. Then we saw the kinetics and kinematics. Now it is the time to start the osteology of the elbow joint, to start the biomechanics of the elbow joint, and that we are starting first by revising the osteology of the elbow joint. Now we are going to see the features of the bones that are forming the elbow joint. So let's start today's lecture. First of all, we must know there are 4 articulations that we are going to see. In elbow there are only 2 articulations, which is your humeroradial joint and humeroulnar joint. But we are studying the elbow joint with the forearm complex also, and we know that forearm complex is formed by 2 joints, which is your proximal radioulnar joint and distal radioulnar joint, also known as superior radioulnar joint and inferior radioulnar joint. So these are the 4 articulations that we are going to see. First is your humeroulnar joint. This is the joint, this is the biggest joint of the elbow, which is formed between the ulna and the humerus. Always remember that your ulna is actually wider and bigger at the proximal end, while it is shorter at your distal end. But your radius bone is shorter at the proximal end and it is larger at the distal end. That is the reason that there is a large portion of ulna which is participating in the elbow joint, and there is a large portion of the radius which is participating in the wrist joint. So these are the 4 articulations. First is the humeroulnar joint, other is humeroradial joint, then we will see the proximal radioulnar and distal radioulnar joints. Now, we have already discussed about the osteology of proximal to mid humerus in our previous lectures when we studied the biomechanics of shoulder, and in this lecture we are going to discuss the mid to distal humerus. What are the features that we must be aware in mid to distal humerus is that we should know where is trochlea, its groove and its medial and lateral lips. Then we must know about the coronoid fossa, we must know about the capitulum, we must know about the radial fossa, medial and lateral supracondylar ridges, medial and lateral supracondyle and olecranon fossa. Let's see them one by one. Now first let's understand the medial epicondyle and what are the structures which are present on the medial epicondyle side. First structure that we must know is the trochlea. Trochlea actually resembles like this wooden stool, like this empty wooden stool, and it is present on the medial epicondyle side. This green portion you can see over here, it is the trochlea and it is resembling somewhat similar to this wooden stool which is empty. One thing that you must know about trochlea is that it is having 2 lips. One is the medial lip and the other one is the lateral lip. These lips are nothing but the extension of the boundaries of these trochlea, and this is of keen importance that the medial lip is actually coming out more distally than the lateral lip. The importance of this thing we will be seeing in the coming slides also, that medial lip is actually extending more distally than the lateral lip. Also there is something which is called as the coronoid fossa. So there is a fossa just proximal to the trochlea, it is called as the coronoid fossa. Also there is one structure which is present on the lateral side of the epicondyle, which is on the lateral epicondyle, it is the capitulum. This ball like structure is called as the capitulum, and there is a fossa above this capitulum which is called as the radial fossa, because this is the fossa for the head of the radius, and this coronoid fossa is actually for this is the space for the coronoid process of the ulna. So till now we have seen the medial epicondyle, the lateral epicondyle, this trochlea. There are 2 lips in the trochlea. Lateral lip is more proximally, medial lip is more distally. We saw the capitulum, then there is a radial fossa above the capitulum, there is a coronoid fossa above the trochlea. Also we must see the supracondylar ridges. So this medial epicondyle and lateral epicondyle, when they are extended proximally, this line or this ridge is actually called as the supracondylar ridge. If it is present at the medial side, then it will be called as the medial supracondylar ridge. If it is present on the lateral side, then it will be called upon as lateral supracondylar ridge. Moving on to the lateral epicondyle side, we must know that this lateral epicondyle side is serving as the attachment site for the lateral collateral ligament and forearm supinator and wrist extensor muscles. Then on the posterior side there is something which is called as the olecranon fossa. This is the fossa or space for the olecranon process. You can see over here in the yellow part, this is your olecranon fossa. Proximal to trochlea, it is very deep and broad olecranon fossa which is present on the posterior side. So till now we have seen the medial epicondyle, the lateral epicondyle, we have seen your trochlea, we have seen the capitulum, your radial fossa, coronoid fossa, medial supracondylar ridge, lateral supracondylar ridge, also the olecranon fossa. Now moving on to the ulna. What are the structures that we must know about the ulna in order to understand the elbow joint biomechanics? First thing that you should know, there is something which is called as the olecranon process. The fossa which was present on the posterior of humerus, that fossa is for the olecranon process articulation. Then there is coronoid process, then there is a trochlear notch and longitudinal crest, radial notch, supinator crest, ulnar tuberosity, ulnar head and styloid process. Starting first with the olecranon process. This is a large blunt proximal tip of the ulna which is making the point of the elbow. Over here you can see this is the point of the elbow and it is called as the olecranon. Also there is a rough posterior surface of ulna which is present on this olecranon process only, that serves as the insertion site for the triceps muscle. So your triceps muscles, lateral head, medial head and long head comes and they attaches at this olecranon fossa which is present at the superior tip of the ulna. Now second thing is the coronoid process. This was the olecranon process. The anterior process over here which you can see after this notch is the coronoid process. It projects sharply from the anterior body of the proximal ulna. So this is the anterior body and this is the posterior body. On the posterior side you have the olecranon process and on the anterior side you are having the coronoid process, and it will be going into the coronoid fossa which was just above the trochlea. Next is the trochlear notch. What is a trochlear notch? The space between the olecranon and coronoid process is called as the trochlear notch. This is a large jaw-like process located between the anterior tip of the olecranon and the coronoid process. One thing that you should know, that it articulates with the trochlea. So this is the structure of ulna is going to form a joint on the medial side of the humerus with the trochlea. So there we are having the trochlea on the humerus and on the ulna we are having the trochlear notch. Then they will be articulating and forming the humero-ulnar joint, which is the biggest joint of your elbow. Humeroradial joint is comparatively a smaller joint when you compare it with the humero-ulnar joint. Now this concave notch we already studied articulates with the trochlea which is convex in nature. So concave articulating surface is provided by the ulna. This will be very important when we will be studying the convex concave rule and rolling and sliding of the elbow joint. So concave surface is provided by the ulna and convex surface is provided by the humerus bone to form the humero-ulnar joint. Then there is radial notch. It is an articulated depression lateral to the inferior aspect of the trochlear notch. So over you can see this is the notch, and this notch is for the radius bone. This notch is for the head of the radius. So head of the radius goes and articulates here with the ulna, and there they form the superior radio-ulnar joint. There is one very interesting thing about the superior radio-ulnar joint, humero-ulnar and humeroradial joint, which is that these three joints share a common capsule. So there is one common capsule for these three joints. Now there is supinator crest distally and slight dorsally from the radial notch. Over here there was a radial notch. Distally and slightly dorsally from this radial notch is the supinator crest attachment for the lateral collateral ligament and the supinator muscle. So over here you will see there is a crest or the tuberosity, roughened surface on the bone, which is serving as the attachment site for the supinator muscle, also for a ligament which is called as the lateral collateral ligament. This is very important and it is present just dorsally and inferiorly to the radial notch. Now one important structure of ulna is the ulnar tuberosity. It is a roughened impression just distal to the coronoid process for the attachment of the brachialis muscle. Over here you can see the tuberosity on the ulna, which is just inferior to the coronoid process, just distal to the coronoid process, and this is the insertion of the brachialis muscle. Brachialis is the most powerful flexor muscle at the elbow joint, having the largest cross-sectional area if you compare it with the brachioradialis or the biceps muscle or pronator teres muscle. So brachialis is also known as the workhorse of the elbow joint, which is actually getting inserted at this tuberosity of the ulna. Also ulnar head at the distal end of the ulna. Over here you can see this is the distal end of the ulna, and this is the head of the ulna, and this is the stelloid process of the ulna. We will see it again when we will study the wrist joint, also the distal radioulnar joint, but for now you should remember that ulnar head is present on the distal side and radial head is actually at the proximal side. Now stelloid process is also there. As I told you, stelloid process is a sharp projection which is present on this, which is coming out from this head. Now moving on to the radius bone in fully supinated position. So this is the fully supination position. This is also the anatomical position, and in this position your radius and ulna is actually parallel to each other. When you are doing the pronation or supination, your ulna is actually fixed, but your radius is moving on the axis of the ulna and at the pronation and supination. So if I ask you which bone is at the rest while pronation and supination is occurring and which is moving, so the answer will be that ulna is always at rest and it is not moving, while pronation and supination at anatomical position, your radius bone is moving or it is spinning. I would say at the superior radioulnar joint and the distal radioulnar joint there is a rolling and sliding, that we will understand in the coming lectures also. Now in radius you should know the radial head. We already discussed this is the head of the radius, this is the neck of the radius, and this is the radial tuberosity. This head is actually going and forming a joint with the radial notch of the ulna, which is also called as the superior radioulnar joint, and this is the radial tuberosity, which is the insertion of the biceps brachii muscle. Then there is a fovea also. If you see the radius from the superior angle, there is a depression, there is a concavity at the radius which is called as fovea, and this fovea actually goes and forms the joint with the humerus bone. That joint is called as humeroradial joint. Fine. So at the humeroulnar end, what was the joint? There you had a trochlea of the humerus, and then there was a trochlear notch of the ulna, and on the humeroradial joint you are having the fovea of the radius and the capitulum of the humerus. Fine. So you are having the fovea of the radius and capitulum of the humerus. Now that I already told you, this is the articulation between your head. This is the trochlea of the humerus, and this is the capitulum. Trochlea is forming the joint with the ulna, and your ulnar, this radial head is forming the joint with the humerus bone. Biceps tuberosity, rough end and radial tuberosity, where there is insertion of the biceps brachii muscle. Ulnar notch accepts the ulnar. Now coming at the distal radioulnar joint, how it is formed. So there we have ulnar notch. In proximal radioulnar joint we had the radial notch for the head of the radius. Now we are having the radial ulnar notch on the radius for the head of the ulna. So, and this is the joint which is formed between the ulnar joint, and then there is the head of the radius. This is the distal radioulnar joint. And that was it. This was just brief about the osteology of the elbow joint, and in the coming lectures we will be seeing the general features, what are the supporting periarticular structures, and also the kinetics and kinematics. We did not go into very deep in understanding this osteology because this was just a revision for you from the anatomy that you must have studied in your first year. Thank you so much. See you in the next class.